For those of you who have seen the movie The Princess Bride, you'll probably recall the Sicilian named Vizzini repeatedly will say the word inconceivable. And then finally, at one point in the movie, Inigo Montoya says to him, "I do not think it means what you think it means." Well, the same is true of the inconceivable number of people who use the term slippery slope. It does not mean what they think it means. This term has been recently invoked many times by advocates of same-sex marriage when they're responding to people who are opposed to same-sex marriage. So listen to just one example of one advocate of same-sex marriage and how he uses this term. He says this: "One of the standard arguments provided by the homophobic right against gay marriage is a form of what we call the domino fallacy or the slippery slope argument. The idea is that if you take a seemingly innocuous first step, it automatically leads to a second, which will force a third, and so on until, next thing you know, there we are in Satan's own living room listening to Yanni on an 8-track. Apparently that's like the worst thing ever. In the case of marriage, the argument goes, if we open up the institution to same-sex couples, then we will be forced down the slippery slope to include all sorts of unusual couplings, including cross-species arrangements." Now let me acknowledge that in my own teaching on same-sex marriage, I argue that if we legalize same-sex marriage, that it'll lead to other forms of marriage that I believe sensible people would be opposed to, things like polygamy or incestuous marriage or group marriage. However, by arguing in this manner, I'm not in any way committing a fallacy or an error in reasoning in any way. And let me explain to you why. You see, there are two kinds of slippery slopes. The first kind is the slippery slope fallacy, also known as the causal slippery slope. And this indeed is a fallacy, or it's an error in thinking. Now, the slippery slope fallacy is like dominoes falling, a line of dominoes falling. And so you take an innocuous first step, and that sets off this chain reaction of dominoes that falls, that eventually leads to an action later down the line that is either morally suspect or evil. For example, I might argue that you shouldn't eat that Reese's peanut butter cup. Why? Because it tastes really good and it's got a lot of sugar in it. And you start eating one, you want to eat a second and a third, and eventually you'll become addicted to sugar. And when you get addicted to sugar, you can't control your actions, and you'll start to go to stores and steal candy. And eventually you'll become a thief, and typically thieves get caught, and when you get caught, you'll get thrown in prison, and your children will grow up as orphans. So the moral of the story here is, don't eat that chocolate because your children will grow up as orphans, right? That innocuous first step eventually leads to something that is morally suspect or evil, so therefore you should abandon the first step. That is a slippery slope fallacy, because it's bad reasoning, because I've strung together a series of events that, although they're related, has no sort of causal mechanism to explain why all the events are connected to one another and why each one causes the next one to occur. Now, the second type of slippery slope is a slippery slope argument, and this is also known as a logical slippery slope. It's not a fallacy, it's not an error in thinking. In fact, it's a valid form of reasoning. It's a valid form of an argument. So this is what's happening here. You have a principle that's used to justify one thing, and then that same principle is used to justify a second thing. And so when the logic of the first thing slips over into the second, you have what's called a logical slippery slope. And so this might cause us to doubt the validity of the first thing if that second thing is something that's undesirable. Let me give you an example. We might say that it's a public good that patrons at a restaurant ought not to be disturbed when they're sitting outside at a patio section of the restaurant eating dinner. Now, we might say that kids who ride skateboards are oftentimes a nuisance to these patrons at restaurants. And so therefore we might pass a policy, the city might pass a policy that bans people from riding skateboards around that area along the sidewalk. Well, that same logic can then slip over into applying to people and families who are just simply riding their bikes, because they could also perhaps be a nuisance. And so then you'd have to also eventually ban bike riding along the sidewalk. Now, here's how this works with same-sex marriage. Someone might argue against same-sex marriage by saying the same justification that you use in favor of same-sex marriage can slip over and be used to argue in favor of group marriage. If they successfully show that, then you can't simply dismiss their view by crying, well, that's just a slippery slope. Because yes, it might be a slippery slope argument, but it's not necessarily a slippery slope fallacy. Those are two different things. The same justification for same-sex marriage could slip over and justify also group marriage. For example, some same-sex marriage advocates argue that same-sex marriage should be legalized because, and here's their reasoning, if two men love each other and they want to get married, then why shouldn't they be allowed to get married? Let them get married. Now notice that same reasoning, that same justification can be applied to a man and 5 women. If that man and those 5 women love each other and they want to get married, then if that's the only requirement, then of course, why not allow them to also get married? That's not hysteria. That's the logic of one slipping over into the other. Or here's another example. Sometimes same-sex marriage advocates will say, look, marriage is evolving and society can define marriage however they please. Therefore, if 2 men want to get married, this is an evolution in marriage and therefore we can define it however we please and we should therefore allow for same-sex marriage. Well, notice that by that same reasoning, we could say, well, what if marriage evolves even further and we can define marriage however we like, and after all, if 2 men and 4 women in a group marriage, want to get married, then we should also, by that same justification, allow them also to be included in the definition of marriage. Because after all, society can define marriage however they like. Notice that in both of these examples, the argument for same-sex marriage, the justification for same-sex marriage, slips over to also justify things like polygamy, group marriage, or even incestuous marriage. By the way, even the Supreme Court of California ruled that this was the case back in 2008 when they ruled in favor of same-sex marriage. Listen to what Supreme Court Justice Marvin Baxter said about the ruling and the rationale in favor of same-sex marriage. He said this: "Who can say that in 10, 15, or 20 years, a court might not rely on the majority's analysis to conclude, on the basis of a perceived evolution in community values, that the laws prohibiting polygamous and incestuous marriages were no longer constitutionally justified?" Notice that he said that the majority's analysis can be used to justify polygamous or incestuous marriages, meaning that the same rationale, the same justification for same-sex marriage can also be applied to these other forms of marriage. In fact, I could point you to dozens of professors, attorneys, court cases, philosophers who all will acknowledge that this is indeed a legitimate slippery slope argument. Here's just one example. Kent Greenfield, who's a Boston College law professor, wrote an article in the American Prospect. And listen to what he said, quote, "You know those opponents of marriage equality who said that government approval of same-sex marriage might erode bans on polygamous and incestuous marriages? They're right. As a matter of constitutional rationale, there is indeed a slippery slope between recognizing same-sex marriages and allowing marriages among more than 2 people and between consenting adults who are related." And get this. The title of the article is "The Slippery Slope to Polygamy and Incest." You see, once you open up the definition of marriage to include same-sex couples, well then you can pretty much define marriage any way you like it and include any sort of coupling or a group of people within that definition. This isn't a scare tactic, it's not hysteria. That's the logic of same-sex marriage that slips over into other areas.